Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we have 7 over 100 player online tournaments to look over this week, and because the Obsidian Flames format hasn't changed a drastic amount, I feel like I'm going to try and do more of a rundown highlights style thing rather than looking at every single top 8 list, because I'll end up repeating myself over and over that it's a standard X or a very simple X or this, that and the other. We'll end up talking about the same archetype 10 or 15 times in a video, and that's just really not worth anyone's time, because we all know the standard shells for the best decks in the room. So we're going to talk about interesting highlights and look at every winning list from the event. I think that's going to be the compromise we go for. For the first place list, we have, unsurprisingly, quite a straightforward Giratina Lost Zone deck. This is looking very similar to Pramort's 60. Actually, it looks like the exact same 60 from the World Championships, and seems to have done very well once again, where it's playing the Snorlax as well as the third copy of Rod. This seems like a mini package that go hand in hand, because you lose more energies if you are attacking with Snorlax rather than Tinas that sort of sit on the board that little bit longer. And really that's all there is to it. Just 2 Path and 1 copy of Iono. I think there's an interesting debate going on with Giratina right now, whether or not it should go higher on Path or lower. I think because there's so much mirror, I'm actually landing on the 2 count being my favourite option right now, but I probably would also work in a Roxanne if I was considering the mirror match a lot more often. A couple other highlights then from this top 8. In second place, actually, it's a DTE based build of Mew, so it's a close your eyes, hope to dodge Spiritomb at all costs based build, but, you know, maybe they're just taking the chance and just saying that in the format there's not enough Tomb right now to be worried. There's going to be this strange tug of war where there's that looming presence of Charizard, but if Charizard's not showing up in a tournament or not doing well in a tournament and you dodge it as the Mew player, then maybe there are people playing less Tombs and Drapions because they're hoping that Charizard deals with the Mew problem, and if that doesn't happen, hey presto, look, Mew's back in a good spot. So yeah, you gotta be trying your luck on the day and hoping you dodge Spiritombs, but we know there's a lot of power behind this build, and surprisingly, actually, the Path Judge element makes you better against Charizard as well as the Mew player. You should have a better time into that matchup, just denying Starbirth and the Rare Candy Pidgeot, etc. So, as long as you're willing to be completely stonewalled by a Spiritomb, there's the DT option still available. The other real story of this week, I think, is that Colourless Lugia has made a big comeback in a lot of these top 8 placements. Starting with this top 8 placement here, we are seeing the Snorlax package coming back in. I feel like in 151, this deck is going to be established and going to be very, very good because of Mew EX, but it seems like the Colourless build is kind of jumping that gun and making the comeback. It did pretty well in the lower age divisions at the World Championships, don't forget, and Luxray is pretty solid right now with enough Palkia around and a decent amount of Mirror. I feel like Luxray is pretty solid as an attacking presence, and playing some interesting cards in here, playing the triple Collapse Stadium as your only counter to Path, as well as obviously Pumpkaboo. There's a bit of a headache with this sometimes, because there'll be situations where you want to double Lugia, sometimes you're using Lumineon turn 1 and whatnot, so if your only bounce then becomes Collapse, sometimes you can block yourself out of Archeops value. That's why sometimes you'll see some Mesogozas in here, but Mesogozas aren't really that powerful of a stadium, so I understand the want to have the high count of Collapse Stadium, because you want to remove the Squawk, the Lumineon, even damaged Lugias and whatnot, to present that single prize race as much as possible. So I understand the mentality here, but I think 3 is probably on that high end, and I wouldn't mind just 1 Mesogoza at least coming back into this deck. But the Echoing Horn also pretty interesting. I think I'd like to see a 3rd Gift Energy if you're going Echoing, because you want to have it when you need it, right? You need to be able to grab that multi-prizer back to actually cash in on it. So I kind of like having the extra gift as an option if you're going to try and make the horn work. But some cool ideas coming in with that 60, no doubt. So that's going to wrap up the qualifier 11. Let's talk about the Battle Park 150 codes. The winning list was a Regieleki build of Miraidon. There's been a lot of hype around Miraidon since the World Championships. Certainly not this build, though, so it's interesting to see kind of this throwback also do pretty well, where the Miraidon has that higher damage output capacity thanks to the Regieleki V Max, helping you push into Giratina, which is really powerful right now in the format, which is definitely solid. It is playing Klefki as well, so has the Switching Bolt early damage poke plays available to it to try and slow down some Lost Engines. So I did struggle when I was testing the Miraidon Flaffy into Lost Zone Giratina quite substantially. So it wouldn't surprise me if this has a better time into the matchup where you just have bounces to path and have that higher damage output available to you, so you are getting through their multi-prizes. So definitely an interesting take on this build. Far less popular than the Flaffy, which has done well at Worlds, but it's cool to see this one making a bit of a resurgence. There's also a Arc Regidrago deck that got second. Definitely an interesting mix of attackers going on. I'm obviously a fan of the Noivern EX, and that's actually one of the bigger selling points of Drago these days. The Altaria, you might need to get familiar with. The Soothing Lullaby attack does 110, and your opponent's active is now asleep. During checkup, they flip twice. And if either is tails, they stay asleep. So I think this is another, like, Panic, Iono, Altaria attack option. Honestly, I don't know how powerful it really is. It doesn't sound too reliable. It doesn't sound too different to just using Rolling Iron anyway, because a lot of the time, that Rolling Iron will put you out of a physical KO no matter what anyway. So I don't know how relevant it is committing a space to this card when you're already on that lower end of consistency, I would say, for the most part. And you can see that just with like 2 Nest Ball in a deck that needs to get Arc down, sometimes multiple if you've gone second turn 1. It's asking a lot, you know, so anytime I can steal a space, I'll try to, and I would probably campaign for that with the Altaria, unfortunately, although it is very cool. And then just another note that, yeah, once again, the colourless build of Lugia showing up once again in this tournament. We move on to Sunny Games, the 3000 code special. The winning deck list was a Lost Zone box with Kyogre, so having that extra element of energy in here this time, rather than having just higher counts of lightning and water, also incorporating some grass energy for a Shaman V for the Revenge Blast option into Charizard. Obviously, because Charizard is a Terra, you actually can't bench snipe it as Kyogre, so maybe that was something that the Kyogre build was struggling with and wanted to have the Shaman damage presence instead, which is a cool option. Seeing the Bruno is a surprise. I feel like even something like Cynthia's Ambition would probably be like a stronger card than Bruno, I think, in most instances. So yeah, that's surprising to not see it be Rox or Cynthia or something along those lines. Other than that, it's a fairly straightforward Kyogre, I want to say. Not too much in terms of surprises from the top 8. A lot of Miraidon, a lot of Tina, and still congrats on doing well, of course, but just not really something that we need to go over every single time we're doing one of these. You guys can explore the standard lists quite easily yourselves. On to the Deck Out Mondays then, and it looked like Gardevoir domination with 3 in the top 4 this time around. The winning list seems to be kind of that straightforward Tord-esque approach with the double reversal energy. It is playing the Worker as well as an Arven, which is kind of interesting, to grab the Forest Seal Stone. It's also got a Gallade in here as a potential additional attacking threat. I do think Swirling Slice is a good option when you are playing higher counts of reversal energy. It really allows you in that Lost Zone sort of matchup where you are usually behind on prizes for quite a lot of the game to attack with Gallade, possibly tank with Gallade whilst you've moved reversal onto maybe a Gardevoir, which can then come in and Brainwave and tank as well. So that's a cool potential option in the deck. Couple of interesting twisty cards, but nothing too outlandish outside of, I would say, probably the Gallade's the strangest thing. Arven helps you get Candy, which is nice, and access to Forest Hill Stone, never a bad thing either, so it's kind of a niche card comparing it to just playing a second copy of Research, but it's really not that terrible. We then have an even more out there second place Gardevoir list, which is playing all basic energy and is playing Squawkabilly EX, which is pretty interesting to see in the list to try and give you that extra push potential, even if you've gone first, which I think is pretty cool. And it's playing 2 copies of the Pokemon League Headquarters. I'm interested to see if this catches on in Gardevoir to help your time into the Lost Zone matchup, because it's still one of your biggest challenges to overcome, where you are increasing the attack cost of basic Pokemon by 1 colourless more. You're making it much more difficult for Sableye to sprinkle over and over again, of course, and that's typically the main line of play that Lost Zone players will go for against you. So yeah, pretty cool to see. Also playing a Miriam in addition to 2 Super Rod. That's a bit of a surprise. It's playing the Penny in here as well, so definitely trying to be quite defensive into the Lost Zone matchups. I think you lose quite a bit by not having any reversal energy. I think it even hurts your prize map in a lot of ways, because you'll be more reliant on your Zacian throughout the entire game, and possibly even more vulnerable to like Lost City, for example, in Mew. So I think you kind of have to play 1 reversal, and honestly I like the 2 counts, but yeah, a different mentality here. I think the idea is because you're going Squawk based and have that element of discard. You don't want to just fall prey to running out and not getting access to your reversals, but I still feel like it's such a big card in the deck. This one also only playing 2 candies and no Forest Silstone either, so quite slow off the mark to get your high roll of the turn 2 Embrace combo for like Cress or anything else getting any sort of hit in, even just a Miracle Force, so bit of a surprise there as well. The rest of the top 8 has an Urshi, a Tina, but then a lot of Lugia in here as well, so pretty good tournament for that deck. We move on to Birthday Bash 3.0, where we have a Rhydon Flaffy, once again doing well. First time we're looking at this sort of build, but this is a very similar to Mahone 60. Feels like it's the exact same list, it looks like it. So doing well from the World Championships and continuing in that fashion with another one also in the top 8, so pretty solid there. Just a quick note on the second place Giratina list. Some people are trying this out where they have 0 water energy in the deck. I feel like especially in open deck lists I don't like this idea because you want to be able to threaten Greninja. So even if I was just in an online event, I would just play 2 water if I'd never really thought about ever using Moonlight Shuriken, because you're still forcing Manaphy into play. And I think in a closed deck list situation, you get away with this possibly a little bit more, but I still feel like Greninja is just a play you want to use in the deck. Even if it feels like it's low odds and you're making Manaphy come into play, that's still good for you. It's still value that as a Manaphy on the board because it gives you a Sableye target and it forces, 1 less search card for your opponent to get normal setup going. So yeah, I feel like the water energy is just so powerful in Tina. I would pretty much always play it, I think. We also get to look at our first Charizard, but it's not the list that you're thinking of. It's actually a Lost Zone variant, which is a really interesting take on Zard. You can see some kind of funky counts going on where we have a 304 line of the Terra Charizard EX. So yeah, really just trying to get a couple of these bad boys going at some point. So you have some high damage output, you have dark type coverage, and your early game is kind of sussed just via Cramorant by the looks of things. We know that Cram into Burning Darkness is a very good number combination to help you get through possibly your opponent's first V-Star Pokemon. Then you're hoping at that stage that hopefully Charizard is sort of taking the wheel and dealing even higher damage output as you work towards the mid-game. I'm a little surprised that there's only 1 Sableye and only 1 Psych Energy. Feels like that combination is just so powerful. I would like 2 of each, to be honest with you. Especially with 3 Rod in the deck, I feel like you don't even need 6 Psychic that much. Sorry, 6 Fire that much, because you could quite easily just get away with reloading and having a late Charizard coming online. I guess because you don't really have any guarantees as and when your Candy Zard is going to come into play. You want to have the full 6 count just in case you like prize 1 or whatever, but yeah, it still feels a little bit weird to me. The heavy Pokestop means at least you're getting into the game. You have the Pal Pad to reload some of your supporters as well. So some elements I like here and something I certainly need to try because Charizard hasn't been impressive from the Arc Pidgeot angle. So possibly it's just the Lost Zone engine that's the best in the game. And is the best way to incorporate this as what is certainly an attacker that gets better and better into the late game. So having a delay on this effect and just knowing that it can come online at any point is a solid idea to have. So something I need to experiment with for sure. We move on to the Full Heal Obsidian number 3, where we have a Tina once again winning the event, looking like a pretty nice list that's incorporating 2 water. Like I said, you can go as low as 2 if you really want to. And we do have another Zard to look at, which I think is pretty interesting. This one is actually the Arc Pidgeot build that we've also sort of come to know a little bit. I'm starting to see the lower count of energy, which I'm definitely a fan of, especially if you're playing Basins anyway. You can easily get away with a count this low, I think, with no issues. Is playing a total of 5 stadium bounces, which is okay, I suppose. Is taking a lot of spaces just for Ball Search, which I think is exactly where you need to be putting these slots. I'm a little surprised in the 2 total switch outs. I feel like a lot of the time you get away with just 1 in the deck. You could even think about this becoming a second DTE, just as a potential attach retreat option, but other than that, looking like a standard list and pretty solid. There's also another list in top 8 here, which is kind of a more arc-focused approach, where you're just trying to develop that turn to Trinity Nova more often than not, and again Charizard becomes more of a late game beat stick. Some interesting inclusions this time where it's actually playing a path of its own in the list, which I think is a bit of a surprise, but is obviously a great like Iono quick search, then grab path and plonk it down option against, your Chien-Paos, against the Mirror, against Gardevoir. This can be a bit of a swing, so I get the idea, but it's still your worst nemesis, and having only 3 outs total to unlocking your deck, I think is pretty low overall, so I'd like to see another card or 2 in there to help with that, but it's cool to see like a more arc-heavy approach. Even though you only really plan to get like 1 arc in play, it feels like overkill and you have so much fluff with the extra arc pieces, but it's just increasing your odds of A, starting an arc, and B, just getting a turn 2 V-Star, which can't be like undervalued, I suppose. And then we go on to probably the wildest top 8 of them all, where we have an Arc Gudra winning the tournament. It's even got Barrel in here as well. Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've seen before, I suppose, and it creates an awkward prize map for a number of decks, especially with the V-Guards in here as well. You've got Box of Disaster to help the sort of middling or uninspiring damage output of Gudra to help out a little bit. So, yeah, it asks questions. It has Caves and Paths as well, so it has Path Judge and Iono Path. I can see the win conditions. I can see the combination being pretty okay. Low damage output is like kind of fine at the moment because you have that reduction and the disruption at your side. So honestly, not too bad. It doesn't look too inspiring, not too fun, not too interesting. But probably asks questions of a lot of decks, and it went undefeated. So yeah, pretty cool. Outside of that, yeah, there was another Arcu, which was basically the same list as above. I think it just played a Spiritomb and a couple other differences. But then also, stealing the show is a Block Lax stall deck. We have seen this before. We saw it all the way back at EUIC, and it seems like it hasn't really evolved too much. I can't see many glaring like new additions or anything like that. You have the mana feed to try and pull things out of the hand. You have, obviously, catchers. You have your Misfortune Sisters to try and pull out their opponent's switch cards and whatnot so that you can trap stuff with block. You have a lot of healing with the pennies, of course, so Lax can be tanking in a number of situations. I still feel like this is one of the weaker control decks that we have in the game right now. If opponents aren't getting completely trolled by a Misfortune Sisters that high rolls you, I think you're almost always going to have enough steam to get through them. But yeah, it's cool to see that every now and then this can make it through and do pretty okay, but I don't think it's really a deck in the format that you have to be too concerned against. Familiarize yourself with the archetype, know what it's trying to do, but in general, just be aware of those things and you don't necessarily have to be too concerned and get a huge amount of games in against it, because I don't think it's going to be showing up at the top tables too often. But before we go, we are going to round out where the format is, where we are in the meta, and that is to say that Lost Tina is still dominating the online scene. This is from the 17th up to the 1st of September, the day of recording. Lost Box, Guardian. Interestingly, Miraidon has really jumped up in this last couple of weeks to being a real threat in the game. I've played around with it. I've not been like overly inspired with Miraidon, but I can see why it's up there. Just by having the paths in the deck, you ask questions of more archetypes, you give them the potential to brick, which just gives you a higher win percentage. You now have like early aggro that you can win with, you have hand disruption that you can win with, and you can sometimes just run away with the game just with high damage output as well if you high roll enough generators and have Raichu plays and whatnot. So a lot of just reasons why there can be different times where you spike the game and take it away from an opponent, which I think is pretty solid. Also, just out of the top 10 was the Colourless Lugia, so that's really been upticking as well. Charizard's continuing to sort of show up here and there, but not be too inspiring. There has been some adaptation, and certainly people will be trying out the Lost variant, I'm sure, just because people already know and like the Lost engine, and Charizard's a new way to kind of play that, so that's interesting. I don't think we saw any Chien-Pao Baxcalibur in any of the top 8s today, so that's had a bit of a rough week, and we saw the kind of interesting DTE-based build of Mew have that one breakout performance. Let's have a look at the matchups before we go, just again to sort of familiarize ourselves with how other archetypes line up to one another. I do have Palkia on here as that 11th deck right now, even though it was the Colourless Lugia that's physically 11th on the stats, just because I feel like they have a very similar matchup spread to the single strike build, so I thought give yourself some extra context with Palkia, and also just the fact that Miraidon has been upticking has been a reason why Palkia maybe wasn't showing up so much this week in online tournaments. Lost Box looking like it has really good stats, but has been hindered by the amount of Rapid Strike in the format right now, and is struggling into the Arc Tinas still, but that's nothing new really. But yeah, Lost Tina still looking very, very solid in the numbers. Lugia looking very solid in the numbers as well, actually, so that's had a really good week. That's pretty much everything to wrap up this week. Let me know if you've liked the slightly different format this time, where I'm giving you the highlights of each tournament rather than looking at every single list, and hopefully it makes it more concise and more interesting. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.